You know that feeling?
Mhm.
When you're trying to get your head around a really big, knotty problem, like, say, figuring out how we can genuinely empower women economically, especially in places already struggling with conflict, instability, it's tough. You're wading through all this research trying to find, the clear signals, and sometimes you just feel buried under it all.
Oh, absolutely. It's one thing to know the problems are there, but it's totally different trying to figure out what steps actually make a difference on the ground.
Exactly. So, welcome to this deep dive. We're aiming to do some of that heavy lifting for you. We've tackled quite a stack of research this time. We've got this really comprehensive, systematic review, pulling together tons of evidence on what works and, maybe just as importantly, what doesn't work for women's economic empowerment in these fragile settings.
Mhm.
And then, to make it really concrete, we're also digging into a new World Bank report focusing specifically on the situation for women's economic empowerment right here in Pakistan.
Yeah, and our goal isn't just to list findings. We really want to get under the hood, understand the why behind the research. Why do some interventions work in these tough environments? And then looking at Pakistan lets us see how those broader lessons might apply or maybe differ in a very specific, complex place.
Right. And that systematic review, it's really helpful because it makes this distinction, doesn't it, between gender-specific things tailored to women's or men's specific needs
Right, considering the current norms.
and gender transformative approaches, the
Hmm.
ones trying to actually change the underlying inequalities, the power dynamic.
Exactly. Aiming for fundamental
And
shifts.
these are all aimed at boosting women's empowerment in places defined as fragile, with high gender inequality. Plus, we'll touch on what helps or hinders these efforts, the barriers and facilitators the research identified. Okay, so maybe let's start by unpacking the setting. What does fragile context actually mean?
Well, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3As, they give a useful definition. They talk about it as a mix. On one hand, you've got exposure to significant risks, violence,
Mm.
economic shocks, political instability, things like that. And on the other hand, there's just not enough capacity, whether it's the state or systems or even communities themselves, to really cope with those risks effectively.
So it's not just about active war. A place could be unstable long term, even without open fighting.
Precisely. And fragility isn't, an on-off switch. It's not uniform. A country might look stable overall, but you can have pockets, regions, specific communities within it that are incredibly vulnerable and just lack the resources or networks to deal with it.
Okay.
That's why the review also looks at efforts towards peaceful and inclusive societies, which
Yeah.
is broader than just no violence. It's about human security, positive peace,
Right.
where there's justice and equity and sustainable, inclusive ways of governing, all tied into the Sustainable Development Goals, of course.
That really highlights the complexity. Okay, so let's talk about the actions, the interventions. We mentioned gender specific and gender transformative. Can you flesh that out a bit more? What's the practical difference?
Sure, the World Health Organization draws a helpful line. Gender-specific basically works within the existing gender norms and roles. It might target women, for example, to address a specific disadvantage they face because of those norms,
Mm-hmm.
like providing maternal health care that meets a specific need linked to being female in that context.
Right, it acknowledges the reality on the ground. So how does gender transformative differ?
Gender transformative tries to go deeper. It actively questions and aims to change the norms, the roles, the power structures that create the inequality in the first place. Often this means working with men and boys too, engaging community leaders, trying to foster more equitable relationships, maybe a program challenging beliefs that limit women's work, for instance.
Okay, so one treats the symptoms, the other aims for the root cause. Got it.
And the review looked really broadly, right? Including interventions for LGBTQIA plus groups too, which is important. Now, this review looked at a huge number of studies, over 100,000 screened. What did it actually find? What seems to make a difference?
Yeah, it was a massive effort. The main focus was women's empowerment and gender equality, but they also looked at wider impacts, like on peace and security. Let's start with asset transfers. That's one area where the review found pretty strong, positive, statistically significant effects.
Asset transfers. So giving people things like capital or livestock, maybe tools.
Exactly. Stuff to start or grow a business, basically. And the review estimated, on average, about a 13.3% increase in women's access to and ownership of assets, land, livestock, that sort of thing, and also in their access to credit and their income.
13%, that's quite something.
It is. And alongside that, about a 2.8% positive shift in women's participation in decision-making, either at home or in the community. That does sound promising. Were there examples that really brought this to life? How did it change things for people?
Yeah, definitely. They highlighted a program in Bangladesh, the IGVGD program. It combined things like food support with microfinance access. Women who got loans could invest, maybe rent land, start small businesses, and it often led to real improvements financially, but also in their sense of, agency. There was a quote from one woman who started a plant nursery with her loan and training, and it grew substantially, gave her real economic freedom.
So it wasn't just the asset itself, the support around it sounds key.
Oh, absolutely critical.
Yeah.
The quality, the type of support matters hugely.
Wow.
They mentioned the EHFP program in Burkina Faso. Their good quality agricultural training alongside the assets really boosted women's skills, their business know-how, even their social standing. But the review also warned the training has to be good, participatory, meeting actual needs. And interestingly, what people wanted varied. Some preferred cash for flexibility, others wanted livestock or specific tools.
That makes total sense. Different needs, different contexts. What about other common approaches, like helping women find jobs, decent work?
Yep, they looked at that too. Initiatives trying to get women into decent work, formal jobs, or sustainable informal work. They did find positive links there, suggesting these interventions can boost women's economic participation. They also saw positive impacts on women having more freedom of movement and association, which is often vital for accessing work outside the home, though they didn't give specific effect sizes for those findings.
Okay. Now, cash transfers are everywhere in development aid. What did this huge review find about their impact on women's empowerment in these fragile places?
The cash transfer findings were, well, more mixed. Interestingly, they didn't find a big difference between conditional cash transfers, where you have to do something like send kids to school, and unconditional ones. And maybe more surprisingly, based on just a couple of studies, they didn't see a significant impact on reducing support for child or forced marriage. Now, important caveat, that's based on only 2 studies, so you have to be careful drawing big conclusions there. More research needed.
That is surprising. You often hear cash transfers framed as directly boosting women's financial autonomy.
They certainly can, and sometimes they do. For instance, the review pointed to 3 studies in Pakistan on the BIST program, the Benazir Income Support Program. Those studies did show positive effects on women's representation in political processes, and it seemed like the longer women were in the program, the bigger the effect. But the review stressed that how cash transfers are delivered really matters. Problems like slow signups because people didn't know about it, logistical headaches getting the cash out, people feeling the amount wasn't enough, those were real barriers. And negative views of the program staff didn't help build trust either.
Right. So it's not just the cash, it's the whole system around it. The delivery, the perception, really crucial. What other kinds of interventions did they look at?
They also looked at inclusive, community-driven development CDD activities. That covers quite a range. Supporting community governance, development planning, grants for infrastructure like roads, water, schools. A key finding there was the absolute importance of getting funds dispersed on time and having decent project management. Delays were a major, major challenge.
And who did communities trust to manage these funds, especially in tricky environments?
It was interesting. In several cases, communities actually preferred external organizations to manage the money, rather than local authorities or traditional leaders, often because of worries about corruption or nepotism. They cited examples from Afghanistan's National Solidarity Program and one in the DRC, Togani one, that showed this.
Wow, that really speaks volumes about governance and trust issues. Okay, what about more formal financial services, like bank loans, savings accounts?
For institutional loans and savings, they found a really large positive impact on women's ability to understand and use financial services. That was based on one study in Nigeria, but it suggests formal finance can be very empowering.
And the less formal routes, things like self-help groups, village savings and loan associations, VSLAs, they seem really common, especially where banks are scarce.
Yeah, VSLAs and SHGs were seen as really valuable, often more accessible for women shut out of formal banking because the requirements are less strict. Though the review noted the very poorest households might use them more for just saving safely, not necessarily borrowing. What was key for success? Good training for leaders and members. Also, having support from other groups to help manage conflicts within the VSLA. But again, wider factors mattered. Access to markets for whatever women produce could limit the benefits. And crucially, men's attitudes, lack of support, dominating household decisions could really hold women back from participating fully, even in these groups.
So even at that local level, the broader social picture is hugely important. The review also covered sensitization campaigns, right?
Yeah.
Trying to shift attitudes about gender.
Yes, and the findings there were pretty positive across a whole range of outcomes. Campaigns showed good results in changing attitudes about women claiming rights, reducing acceptance of violence against women, boosting support for prevention, improving women's self-image, increasing support for women's rights generally. Also, raising community awareness, reducing intimate partner violence, improving relationships, and boosting overall women's empowerment scores.
That sounds really impactful. What made them work?
It seems like a key factor was when community leaders and people from the target groups themselves became agents of change, when they promoted the messages. That created a strong positive influence. The Indishikirwa program in Rwanda was mentioned as a good example of that.
Interesting. I also saw all-women police stations mentioned. What did the research find there?
That's an area where the evidence is still pretty thin, actually.
Yeah.
The idea makes sense. Create safe spaces with trained women officers for reporting gender violence, build trust. But the review only found one study looking at impact from India, and it showed a very small effect on women's access to justice, and it wasn't statistically significant. So the concept might be good, but we need more solid research on how to make them truly effective.
Okay. What about discussion groups? Just getting people talking about gender equality, does that create change?
Well, the theory is sound, right? Information leads to thinking differently, changing behavior, promoting equality and peace. But the review only found 2 studies looking at their impact on women's assets and income, and the effects were small, not significant. It probably depends a lot on having regular, meaningful dialogue over time, which is hard to achieve and measure.
And lastly, safe spaces for women and girls. What came out there?
Safe spaces showed positive, significant impacts on women getting more assets, credit, and income. So that's good. They also had smaller, positive effects, though not always statistically significant, on other things like understanding finance, control over their bodies, freedom of movement, life skills, maybe reducing child marriage, more participation in decisions, better relationships. Mentors seemed really important in these spaces. They encouraged collaboration, provided support, and actually made parents more comfortable letting girls participate.
Mentorship. Okay.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, longer time in a safe space was maybe linked to smaller impacts on owning assets, which is a bit counterintuitive. And the program seemed to have bigger effects where gender inequality was higher to start with. Peer mentoring, learning from each other's experiences, that came through as a real strength, like in the Compass program in Afghanistan.
So a really rich, diverse picture from that review. Some clear wins, some mixed results, lots of nuance. Okay, let's pivot now specifically to Pakistan, using the World Bank report. What's the big picture there for women's economic empowerment?
Well, the report paints a, frankly, concerning picture. Female labor force participation is persistently low. It has crept up a tiny bit over time, but really slowly. The gap between men and women in the workforce is just stark and hasn't closed much.
That's fundamental. What about access to finance? Can women in Pakistan easily use banks, get loans?
That's another major gap the report highlights. Women are only about half as likely as men to have an account at a financial institution, which means roughly 55 million women in Pakistan are unbanked. That's a huge number. And the gap's even wider for mobile money accounts. It's especially tough for women entrepreneurs. They're way less likely to get loans or have bank accounts than men running businesses. Why? The report points to things like less access to official IDs, lower mobile phone ownership, and lower financial literacy contributing to this.
So really basic access issues are still huge hurdles. Does the legal and policy environment help or hinder women's economic participation in Pakistan?
According to the World Bank report, Pakistan is lagging behind many other countries on the legal front. Key areas like accessible childcare, laws against discrimination in hiring, flexible work options, proper maternal leave policies. Pakistan's framework in these areas is weaker than global benchmarks.
That lack of childcare seems like a massive barrier. Did the report look at the potential impact of fixing that?
Well, there isn't much Pakistan-specific research directly on childcare's impact, but the report does cite strong evidence from other low- and middle-income countries, including nearby in South Asia. That research consistently shows that affordable, quality childcare and preschool really helps women join and stay in the workforce. So it strongly suggests that investing in childcare in Pakistan could be a really important lever, even if we need more local data to be sure.
Where are women working in Pakistan, mostly?
Agriculture. It's still the dominant sector by far. For women, something like 68% of employed women work in ag, compared to only about 28% of men. There are in other sectors too, like education, manufacturing, health, but much less so in areas like construction or finance. And that heavy reliance on agriculture makes women really vulnerable to climate shocks, droughts, floods.
And the overall employment picture, earnings, big gender gaps there too.
Huge gaps. The report shows over 75% of women are not employed, compared to about 21% of men. That's a massive difference. And even when women are employed, men tend to work significantly more hours per week. Earnings. Wage-employed women earn about 82 cents for every dollar a man earns. And for self-employed women, it's much worse. Their incomes are only about 29% of self-employed men's incomes, on average.
Just staggering disparities. What about technology? Access to computers, internet, does that play a role?
Yes, and there are big gender gaps there, too. Fewer women in Pakistan use computers or the internet compared to men, which, of course, limits their access to information, online markets, digital finance, things that are increasingly vital for economic life.
Safety and just being able to move around freely, often critical for women. How does Pakistan look on that front?
The report confirms safety and mobility are major issues. Women are about 3 times more likely than men to say they feel unsafe walking alone in their neighborhood at night. And these safety fears, fear of harassment, are a big reason why many women end up working from home. Interestingly, the report found that home-based workers who did have more freedom to move around also tended to have better access to market information, financial services, and more say in decisions. So safety, mobility, economic agency, they're all tightly linked.
And the report also talks about those deep-seated social norms influencing things.
Oh, absolutely. Social norms have a huge impact on what jobs are seen as okay for women, on their control over money, their decision-making power. The report cites data, like from the World Values Survey, showing that people with more traditional views on women's roles are less likely to see women working for pay. It's complex, the influence probably goes both ways, but norms are clearly a massive factor. The report also has data linking norms to things like land ownership, tolerance of domestic violence, and women's decision-making power. It paints a clear picture.
Given all that, are there any specific policies or interventions that seem particularly promising for Pakistan, even if the local evidence is still developing?
Mobile money comes up as potentially transformative, helping women control finances and save. Though the strongest evidence cited is from Bangladesh, not Pakistan directly. Land redistribution programs. Mixed impacts on women's property rights, it seems. Giving capital to women entrepreneurs. Can help already successful businesses, but doesn't always translate into broader empowerment. Business training in Pakistan improved knowledge, apparently, but not always business outcomes. Maybe because women lack the final say in decisions at home.
Right, the agency piece again.
Exactly. Job platforms, also mixed. Gender criteria in job ads seem to be a big barrier, especially for less educated women. Asset transfers show promise globally for poverty, but we need more Pakistan-specific evidence on the gender impacts, although some studies elsewhere using gender-sensitive coaching looked good. And finally, the report confirms what influences women's decision-making: education, wealth, age, marital status, living in a city. And sadly, more conservative gender views link to higher tolerance for domestic violence.
So a really intricate picture. From the global research and the Pakistan specifics, if you had to boil it down, what are the key takeaways for our listener from this deep dive?
Okay, from the big systematic review. Some things show real promise. Asset transfers, if paired with good training and support, can significantly boost women's resources and decision-making. Community savings groups, VSLAs, offer valuable routes to finance, but norms and support really shape their success. Well-designed sensitization campaigns can genuinely shift attitudes and reduce acceptance of violence. But for other things like unconditional cash or even all-women police stations, the impact seems really context-dependent. Needs careful implementation, more solid evaluation.
And the Pakistan focus.
The World Bank report really drives home the persistent challenges. Low female labor participation, big gaps in finance, digital access, earnings. Social norms and safety concerns are huge barriers restricting opportunities and mobility. While things like mobile money or maybe asset transfers hold promise based on wider evidence, Pakistan really needs more local research to tailor interventions effectively. And fixing those legal gaps, childcare, non-discrimination laws, that seems critical.
It really hammers home that there's no magic bullet, is there? It needs a multi-pronged approach, taxing norms, safety, resources, and the legal stuff all at once.
Precisely. The research keeps coming back to the need to really understand and address those underlying social and cultural drivers shaping women's economic lives, especially in these fragile settings.
So lots to think about. Here's a final question for you, our listener, to mull over. Given all this evidence, the global picture, the specifics of a place like Pakistan, what do you see as the absolute crunch points? Where should the focus and investment go to really accelerate women's economic empowerment in the specific fragile contexts you care about? And what follow-up questions do you have about making these interventions truly work on the ground? We definitely encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging deeper into this vital topic,